The morning Maggie Ralston rode back into Caldwell, Kansas. The sky above the prairie was the color of a bruise, and every soul who watched her come down the main street knew exactly what kind of woman they believed her to be. It was the spring of 1879, and Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a splinter in the thumb of civilization, rough and sore, and impossible to ignore. The cattle drives rolled through every season, leaving behind dust and money and trouble in equal measure, and the town had grown fast around that commerce, throwing up false-fronted buildings and a church steeple that caught the wind like a flag. The people who built those buildings believed in order, in reputation, in the kind of Sunday morning respectability that required someone to stand below it. And for the last 3 years, that someone had been Maggie Ralston. She was 26 years old, and she sat her horse like she had been born in the saddle, her dark auburn hair pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days, her traveling coat dusty from 2 weeks on the road. She carried everything she owned in 2 saddlebags, which was not much, and she kept her chin up as she rode, even though every instinct she possessed told her to look at the ground. She had come back because she had nowhere else to go. That was the truth of it, plain and unadorned. The town of Abilene had dried up for her kind of work, which was honest work, laundering and mending, the kind of labor that left your hands cracked and your back aching, but the kind of labor that let you sleep without shame. She had saved enough money to start fresh somewhere, and Caldwell was the town she knew, even if knowing it cut both ways. The problem with Caldwell was that Caldwell remembered. 3 years ago, when her husband Hector Ralston had drunk himself to death in the back room of the Lone Star Saloon, he had left her with 2 things. The first was his name, which she kept because it was hers by law and she had earned it through 3 years of endurance. The second was his debt, which she had not known about until the creditors came knocking the morning after she buried him. There was no money, no land, no livestock. There was nothing but a ramshackle house on the edge of town and a husband's reputation that was considerably worse than she had understood during their marriage. To pay the debt and keep herself fed, Maggie had taken work at the Lone Star Saloon. Not the kind of work the town assumed, though the assumption was made before she had even walked through the door. She had served drinks and she had played the piano, and she had done nothing more than that, but in Caldwell in 1876, a widow woman working in a saloon was a woman who had made her choice, and the town was not interested in the particulars. Mrs. Dorothy Crane, who ran the seamstress shop in the quilting circle and what passed for society in Caldwell, had organized a quiet but devastatingly effective campaign to make Maggie unwelcome. There were no invitations to church socials. There were cold shoulders in the dry goods store. There were whispers that followed her down the street like a second shadow. And eventually, there had been a formal petition, signed by 14 of the town's most prominent women, asking the mayor to encourage Maggie to relocate, which was a polite way of telling her that her presence was a corruption of community values. She had left because fighting it alone was a battle she could not win with empty hands. She had gone to Abilene and made herself invisible and worked until her fingers bled. And now here she was, riding back in because the rent in Abilene had gone up and the laundry work had dried up, and this was still the place where she knew the geography of every street. She rode to the edge of town where old Cyrus Webb still rented rooms above his harness shop, because Cyrus had always been indifferent to gossip, being mostly deaf and entirely focused on leather and buckles. She paid him 3 weeks in advance from her careful savings and climbed the narrow staircase to a room that smelled of oil and hay, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and breathed slowly and told herself that this was manageable. She was wrong about that, but she did not know it yet. Roscoe Granger had been in Caldwell for 2 years when Maggie rode back in, and he had built himself something real in that time. He was 32 years old, broad across the shoulders, with hands that were permanently calloused from fence wire and saddle leather, and a face that the sun had weathered into something that might have been handsome if you looked at it in the right light. He had a ranch 5 miles south of town, 360 acres of good Kansas grassland that he had bought with the money he had saved across 9 years of working other men's herds up from Texas. The Granger spread, as it was beginning to be called, ran 200 head of longhorns and employed 4 ranch hands who were loyal because Roscoe paid fair and expected fair in return. He had a good house, not grand but solid, built with timber he had hauled in himself and chinked himself, with a fireplace that drew properly and a porch that faced west so he could watch the sunset come in over the flat land. He was, by any reasonable measure, a man who had arrived. He came into Caldwell every Saturday for supplies, and once a month for a haircut from Eli Bates, the barber who also served as the town's informal newspaper, broadcasting every piece of news and rumor with equal enthusiasm. It was Eli who told him about Maggie Ralston's return, not because Eli thought Roscoe would care particularly, but because Eli told everyone everything. "Widow Ralston's come back," Eli said, running his scissors with practiced ease around Roscoe's ear. "Rode in this morning. Cyrus Webb's taken her in. Dorothy Crane is already holding court at the millinery about it." "That's so," Roscoe said, which was not really a question. "Folks remember her. Bad business with that husband of hers, then the saloon work. Dorothy says it's a shame to have that element returning to a God-fearing town." Roscoe said nothing further, and Eli took the silence as indifference and moved on to discuss a fence dispute between 2 neighboring ranchers. But Roscoe had heard enough, and what he had heard sat with him the way an uncomfortable saddle sits during a long ride, shifting and nagging. He had heard of Maggie Ralston before he ever set foot in Caldwell. The story traveled the way stories did along the cattle trail, embellished and distorted, but even through the distortion you could sometimes see the shape of the truth underneath. What he had heard was a woman who had worked honestly to pay a dead man's debts and been crucified for it by people who preferred their judgments simple and their women invisible. He had not given her much thought beyond that. He had his ranch to build and his cattle to tend, and other people's stories were other people's business. But hearing it again now, hearing Dorothy Crane's name attached to it, hearing the comfortable ease with which a whole town could dismiss a woman who had done nothing more than survive, something in his chest tightened in a way that was harder to ignore than he expected. He paid Eli and walked out into the afternoon sun and thought about it for the 3 steps it took to reach his horse, and then he told himself it was none of his concern and rode home. Maggie spent her first week back in Caldwell quietly, which was the only strategy available to her. She called on Mrs. Henderson at the laundry on Maple Street, who looked at her for a long moment before agreeing to give her piecework, sheets and shirts and table linens, which Maggie could take back to her room at Cyrus's and do privately. It was less money than working in the laundry directly, but Mrs. Henderson was not unkind, merely cautious, and Maggie understood the distinction. She went to the dry goods store on Tuesday morning and bought flour and salt pork and coffee, and a small bag of dried beans, keeping her eyes forward and her voice even, and she ignored the way Reverend Booth's wife suddenly found something urgent to examine on the far side of the store when Maggie walked in. She walked back to Cyrus's with her purchases and climbed her stairs and cooked her supper on the small iron stove and ate it alone. On Thursday, she walked to the church because it was a public building, and she had as much right as anyone to sit in a pew and pray. And she was halfway up the steps when Dorothy Crane appeared at the door with the specific magnificence of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Dorothy was 50 years old and substantial, with iron-gray hair and a silk dress that had come all the way from St. Louis, and a face that had been trained over decades into an expression of charitable concern that contained absolutely no charity whatsoever. "Mrs. Ralston," she said, and the title was deployed like a weapon. "I had heard you'd return to us." "Good morning, Mrs. Crane," Maggie said. "I wonder if you've considered whether this is truly the best environment for you. The congregation here is a particular kind of family with particular standards of conduct. I would not want you to feel unwelcome." "I appreciate your concern," Maggie said, which was a lie, and both of them knew it. "There is a congregation in Wichita that I understand is rather more accommodating of varied circumstances," Dorothy said. "Some people find it easier to make a fresh start in a place without existing associations." Maggie looked at her for a moment, at the carefully constructed wall of her, the absolute certainty that she was right and righteous and serving the community's best interest, and she felt something flicker in her chest that was half grief and half anger, and she kept it off her face. "I'll bear that in mind," she said, and she walked up the remaining steps and through the door and took a pew near the back and clasped her hands and prayed, quietly and sincerely, for the strength not to say what she was thinking. Dorothy Crane watched her from the door and then turned away with the satisfied expression of a woman who believes she has done her duty. Roscoe came into town that Saturday, as he always did, and was loading his wagon at the dry goods store when he heard two women talking on the opposite side of the main street with no particular effort at privacy. He recognized Dorothy Crane's voice before he turned around, and he recognized the name she was using. "The woman has no shame," Dorothy was saying to a younger woman he knew as Mrs. Patterson, who had arrived in Caldwell with her surveyor husband 6 months ago and was still learning who to align herself with. "Coming back here as though nothing happened, as though the whole town doesn't know what she was." "What was she exactly, Mrs. Patterson asked, and Roscoe, who had very good hearing, noted the genuine uncertainty in her voice. "A saloon woman," Dorothy said, with a gravity that made it sound like the gravest of sins. "After Hector Ralston died, God rest him, she went to work at the Lone Star. It speaks to a certain character, a certain willingness to disregard what is decent." "I heard she played the piano there," Mrs. Patterson said carefully. "The details are not the point," Dorothy said, which was the thing people said when the details undermined their argument. "The point is the association, the atmosphere, what it means for the young women of this town to see that kind of example." Mrs. Patterson made a noncommittal sound, and Roscoe turned back to his loading and found that his jaw was tight. He finished loading his wagon and drove it to the edge of the street and sat there for a moment, reins in hand, before he made a decision that he had not particularly planned to make. He drove to Cyrus Webb's harness shop and tied his horse and went inside and found Cyrus polishing a bridle with the focused attention of a man who is at peace with his occupation. "Cyrus," Roscoe said, "the woman renting your upstairs room, Maggie Ralston, can you tell her I'd like a word if she's willing?" Cyrus looked at him with the slight squint of a man who is not quite sure he has heard correctly, then nodded and went to the base of the stairs and called up, loudly enough to penetrate his own hearing difficulties, that there was a man below asking to speak with her. There was a pause, then footsteps on the stairs, and Maggie Ralston came down into the harness shop, and Roscoe Granger saw her in person for the first time. She was taller than he had imagined, with a straight-backed bearing that spoke of someone who had learned to carry herself carefully in hostile territory. Her hair was dark auburn, loose today around her shoulders in the dim interior of the shop, and her eyes were a brown so deep they looked almost black in the low light. She was wearing a plain blue working dress, and there was a faint ink stain on her left hand that he noticed because he was paying attention. Her face was guarded in the way a face gets when it has been guarded for a long time. "I don't believe we've met," she said, which was not entirely unfriendly, only careful. "Roscoe Granger," he said, taking off his hat. "I have a ranch south of town. I've been in Caldwell 2 years. I know we haven't met, but I know who you are, and I wanted to say something to you directly rather than let it float around." Her chin lifted slightly. "All right. You've got as much right to be in this town as anyone else in it," he said, "and I think what's being done to you is wrong. I'm not saying that to get anything from you. I'm just saying it because it's true and because it seemed like you might need to hear it from someone who isn't Mrs. Crane." She looked at him for a moment that stretched in a way that was somehow not uncomfortable, and something shifted in her expression, not quite softening, but adjusting, the way a door shifts in its frame when the humidity changes. "That is kind of you, Mr. Granger," she said at last. "It's honest, which is a different thing," he said. "I thought you should know there are people in Caldwell who aren't interested in what Dorothy Crane thinks." He put his hat back on and nodded to her and walked out of the shop, and Maggie stood in the dim interior smelling of oil and leather and watched him go, and felt, for the first time since riding back into Caldwell, that the ground under her feet might be slightly less unstable than she had assumed. She went back upstairs and sat at her small table and thought about what had just happened for considerably longer than she thought about most things. 2 weeks passed. Maggie settled into a rhythm that was spare and solitary but functional. She took in laundry from Mrs. Henderson and mended shirts and linen for 3 households that were willing to send work her way quietly, which was less humiliating than it would have been if she allowed herself to feel its small indignities. She was saving money carefully, and she was managing. Then on a Tuesday afternoon she went to the dry goods store and found the door locked, and a note pinned to it saying the store would be closed until Wednesday, and the only other place to buy flour in Caldwell was the General Mercantile at the far end of Main Street, which was owned by Gerald Pratt, who was Dorothy Crane's son-in-law. She went anyway because she needed flour and there was no alternative. Pratt was behind the counter, a thin man with a small mustache that he kept touching, and when Maggie put her list on the counter he looked at it and then looked at her and said, with perfect calmness, that he was afraid he was unable to serve her. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm afraid this establishment serves families of good standing," he said. "I'm sure you understand." She understood perfectly. She picked up her list and left without another word, because there was nothing she could say in Gerald Pratt's Mercantile that would not become ammunition for the next round of Dorothy Crane's campaign. She walked back down the main street and her face was composed and her stride was even and she was perfectly fine until she was back in her room and the door was closed. And then she sat down hard on the bed and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and breathed. She was not crying. She was simply managing the pressure of something that had been building for 3 years and had not found adequate release. She did not let herself sit long. Sitting was the first step toward giving up, and giving up was not a luxury she could afford. She got up and washed her face and went back to her work. Roscoe came into town that Saturday with a wagon needing supplies and stopped first at the dry goods store, which was open again, and then by habit, he went to check the bulletin board outside the post office where odd jobs and community notices were posted. He found a notice he had not expected to find. It was a formal letter, printed in careful block capitals on good quality paper, addressed to the residents of Caldwell, from the Ladies' Committee for Community Standards, which was Dorothy Crane's organization wearing a formal name. The letter stated that it had come to the committee's attention that a person of questionable moral character, referred to only as a recent returnee to the community, was conducting business in the town, and that respectable establishments were urged to consider whether extending trade to such a person was consistent with the values of the community. It was a masterpiece of oblique destruction. It named no name, but everyone would know exactly who was meant. It created an unofficial embargo without the legal awkwardness of making it official. It was the kind of thing that worked precisely, because it operated in the space between what could be proven and what was simply understood. Roscoe read it twice and folded it and put it in his coat pocket and finished his shopping in a silence that his ranch hand, Pete Donovan, who had ridden in with him, recognized as the particular silence that preceded something. "Boss," Pete said carefully, as they loaded the wagon. "You got that look." "What look?" Roscoe said. "The one you got when Johnson over at the Rocking J tried to claim that piece of your south fence line was his." "I dealt with that," Roscoe said. "I know, that's what I mean by the look." Roscoe glanced at him. "Go get yourself a drink at the Lone Star. I'll meet you at the wagon in an hour." Pete read the room accurately and went. Roscoe walked down Main Street to the harness shop and went upstairs and knocked on the door of Maggie's room, which was a thing he had not done before, and he held his hat in his hands when she opened the door and looked at him with that careful, guarded expression. "I need to show you something," he said. "I'm sorry to disturb you." She read the notice he handed her without visible emotion, which was a skill she had clearly practiced, and handed it back to him. "It's effective," she said. "I'll give her that." "It's wrong," he said, "and I want to do something about it, but I wanted to ask you first because it's your life and not mine, and you have the right to tell me to stay out of it." She looked at him with those deep brown eyes that were calculating and honest at the same time. "What do you want to do?" "I want to call a town meeting," he said. "Or not even a formal meeting. I want to speak publicly. I want to say your name out loud and say what I actually know about your situation, and let people make up their minds with real information instead of Dorothy Crane's version." Silence in the small room. A wagon passing in the street below sent a bar of afternoon light wavering across the floorboards between them. "That will make you a target," she said. "Dorothy Crane does not forgive people who oppose her publicly. I know that. It might cost you business. People might stop wanting to sell you things or buy from you. I've considered that." "Why?" she asked, and it was the simplest and most direct question, containing everything she actually wanted to know. He thought about how to answer it honestly. He was not a man who liked elaborate explanations or who had the natural gift for pretty speeches, but he had always been able to find plain words when they were needed. "Because I spent 9 years working for other men and following other people's rules and watching how the world decides who gets dignity and who doesn't," he said. "And what I watched was that the people who get to decide are usually the ones with the most to lose from real honesty, and the people they decide against are usually the ones who were just trying to survive. And I am tired of that being how it works and not doing anything about it when I have the ability to do something." Another silence. Then Maggie said quietly, "I played the piano there at the Lone Star. I served drinks. I paid Hector's debts and I left and I came back. That is the whole story." "I know," he said. "You know because you believe me. Mrs. Crane doesn't care what the story is." "No," he said, "but there are others in this town who might, if someone gave them the chance to hear it plainly." She looked at him for a long time, this rancher she had met once for 5 minutes in a harness shop, who was standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands and a particular kind of steadiness in his eyes that she recognized as rarer than gold in her experience of men. "All right," she said. "Do what you think is right. I want you there," he said, "in the square, when I speak. You want me to stand there while people look at me. I want you to stand there while people hear the truth about you," he said. "It's different." The town meeting was not a formal affair, because Roscoe had not gone to the mayor to arrange one. Instead, he had ridden through town on Friday afternoon and spoken to people directly, men and women he knew from business and from the ordinary commerce of life in a small town, and he had said that he had something to say in the town square on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock, and he would be obliged if they would come and hear it. Word spread in the way that significant things spread in a small town, which was fast and thorough. By Friday evening, everyone in Caldwell knew something was happening. Dorothy Crane knew, because Dorothy Crane always knew, and she spent Friday evening making social calls and applying pressure with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has been operating this particular kind of machinery for 30 years. Saturday morning came in bright and dry. The Kansas sky above Caldwell vast and pale blue, the kind of morning that made the prairie look like it extended forever in every direction. The town square, which was really just the widened section of Main Street in front of the courthouse, had a small crowd gathered by 9:45. Maggie had spent Friday night not sleeping very well, which she did not admit to anyone. She had lain on her narrow bed and watched the darkness above her and thought about what she was agreeing to. She was agreeing to stand in public and let a man defend her and let all of Caldwell watch it happen. She was agreeing to be visible instead of quiet, which was the opposite of every survival strategy she had developed over the past 3 years. But there was something about the way Roscoe Granger had stood in her doorway with his hat in his hands and spoken plainly about dignity that had gotten under her defenses in a way that pure self-interest hadn't. Not because he was kind, though he appeared to be, because he was angry about the right thing. Because the thing he was angry about was the thing that had been quietly destroying her for 3 years, and he was angry on her behalf, not out of pity but out of principle, and she had not experienced that before and did not know precisely what to do with it. She put on her best dress, which was deep green wool, and she pinned her hair properly, and she walked to the town square at 5 minutes to 10. Roscoe was already there, standing beside his horse at the edge of the square, talking to Pete Donovan and a man named Frank Albright who ran the local feed store and was generally regarded as a reasonable man. He saw Maggie coming and straightened, and for a moment there was something in his expression that she caught before he arranged it back into composure, something that looked very much like admiration. "You look well," he said, which was a plain sort of compliment but delivered as though he meant it precisely, which she found more effective than elaborate flattery would have been. "I'm terrified," she said honestly, because she had decided somewhere between Friday night and this morning that honesty was the appropriate register for whatever this was. "So am I," he said, which surprised her because he did not look it. "I've ridden into cattle stampedes that scared me less." "At least with stampedes you know what's charging at you," she said. He laughed, a brief genuine sound, and she felt the tightness in her chest ease fractionally. Dorothy Crane arrived at 8 minutes past 10 with 3 other women from the Ladies' Committee for Community Standards and positioned herself at the front of the assembled crowd with the strategic placement of someone who has long understood that physical positioning is a form of power. She saw Maggie and her expression sharpened into something that was nearly pleasure, the particular pleasure of someone who expects to win. There were perhaps 40 people in the square now. Roscoe counted quickly and noted with some satisfaction that Frank Albright had brought his wife, and that 2 of the 3 men who ran the Cattle Association had come, and that Reverend Booth himself was standing to one side with the careful expression of a man who is reserving judgment, which was better than active opposition. Roscoe Granger stepped forward into the open space in the middle of the square. He did not raise his voice immediately. He waited for the crowd to settle and quiet, and the silence he created by waiting had a particular quality that made people pay attention. "Thank you for coming this morning," he said, and his voice was steady and carried well across the open space. "I'll keep this brief because I have cattle to tend, and I imagine most of you have things to get to as well." A ripple of something, not quite laughter, not quite tension, through the crowd. "Most of you know me well enough," he said. "I came to Caldwell 2 years ago. I built my ranch from nothing. I pay my taxes and I pay my debts, and I have never given this town a reason to doubt my word. I'm telling you that because I want you to understand that what I'm about to say, I believe to be absolutely true." He turned slightly, just enough that the crowd could see both him and Maggie, who was standing 6 feet away at the edge of the clear space. He did not look at her yet. He looked at the crowd. "Maggie Ralston is a woman who came to this town and married a man who was not equal to her trust," he said. "When that man died, he left her nothing but debts. She paid those debts through honest labor. She then left this town and worked honest labor elsewhere for 3 years. She has come back because this is the town she knows. And some of us who have enjoyed the benefits of her absence while bearing none of its cost, have decided that we have the right to tell her she is not welcome here." He let that land. Around the square, people were very still. Dorothy Crane's chin was up and her expression was perfectly controlled. The younger women around her were less certain. "I want to say her name out loud," Roscoe said, and now he did look at Maggie, directly and without apology, and his voice dropped just a fraction of a register that somehow made it carry more rather than less. because I have heard it used as a way to shame a woman who has done nothing shameful, and I will not be party to that. Her name is Maggie Ralston, and she has my respect, and if any of you are the honest people I believe you to be, she is yours as well." The square was quiet for a long moment. Then Frank Albright said, clearly and with the deliberate weight of a man who has chosen his moment, "Hear, hear." Two of the Cattle Association men nodded. Mrs. Albright looked at Dorothy Crane with an expression that was polite and final. Reverend Booth cleared his throat and said, in a voice that was carefully balanced between his pastoral duty and his personal discomfort, "I think Mr. Granger speaks to the better part of our Christian obligations." Dorothy Crane turned to the woman next to her and said something quietly, and then she turned and walked away from the square with her committee trailing behind her, and she did it with impeccable dignity, and everyone present understood perfectly that she was not admitting defeat but simply withdrawing to regroup, and that the battle was not over. But the moment that mattered had happened. The words had been spoken. The name had been said out loud with pride in a public place by a man whose word in Caldwell was established and respected, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, considerable. Maggie stood in the morning sunlight and felt something move through her chest that was large and warm and almost frightening in its intensity. She pressed her hands together at her sides and kept her face composed. Roscoe walked back to her and stopped at a respectful distance and looked at her with the question in his eyes that he did not ask out loud. "You said my name," she said. "I did. With all those people listening." "That was rather the point," he said. She looked at him for a moment and then she said very quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Granger." "Roscoe," he said, "I think we're past surnames." And to her own surprise, Maggie Ralston smiled, and it was the first real smile she had produced in longer than she could precisely calculate, and it did something to Roscoe Granger's chest that he was not prepared for, and that he spent the drive home thinking about with considerably more attention than he had given anything in recent memory. The aftermath of the square was not an immediate triumph. Life in a small town was not organized like a story, where one significant moment resolved everything cleanly. Dorothy Crane did not disappear, and the ladies' committee did not disband, and there were still people in Caldwell who looked at Maggie with the particular coolness of those who have committed to a judgment and are too proud to revise it. But things shifted. Not dramatically, but perceptibly, the way the balance of a room shifts when someone moves furniture. Frank Albright's wife, whose name was Clara, appeared at Cyrus Webb's door 3 days after the square with a week's worth of good linen needing laundering, and a manner that was straightforwardly friendly. A cattle rancher named Thomas Birch stopped Maggie on the street to introduce himself and say that Granger had spoken well, and that Caldwell was big enough for people of good character. 2 women from the eastern side of town, who were not part of Dorothy's circle, and had never had any particular opinion of Maggie one way or the other, began to include her in the nods of acknowledgment that constituted civil greeting. Gerald Pratt's mercantile remained closed to her, and the Reverend Booth's wife still managed to be elsewhere whenever Maggie came to church. But the active campaign against her had lost momentum, because Roscoe Granger's public declaration had made the campaign visible, and visibility made it harder to sustain. What Maggie had not anticipated was Roscoe himself. He had come to the square for principle. She was certain of that, because it was the kind of thing he was, the kind of man who acted when his sense of what was right demanded action. But he came back to Cyrus Webb's harness shop the following Wednesday with a small parcel of coffee and dried apricots and a completely transparent excuse about needing to check on a harness fitting that was clearly already fine. "You didn't need to do this," she said, looking at the parcel. "I was at the dry goods store anyway," he said, "and you can't get into Pratt's yet." Yet, she noted the word. "That may be a permanent situation." "Pratt does what his mother-in-law tells him," Roscoe said. "Dorothy Crane doesn't have unlimited patience. People get tired. She'll find something else to be exercised about before long." "You have a fairly optimistic view of human nature," Maggie said, "for a man who has presumably met humans." He looked startled for a moment and then laughed, and it was the same brief, genuine sound she had heard in the square before everything began, and she felt it again, that small, dangerous easing of something. "Come and look at something," he said, and she looked at him questioningly, and he said, "I want to show you the river road. The cottonwoods are coming in this week, and it's worth seeing. If you're willing to take a walk." She considered this. It was a transparent invitation for her company, which she found she did not mind at all. "I'll get my coat," she said. They walked the river road that afternoon, which was half a mile from the main street and flanked by cottonwood trees that were just beginning to push out their new leaves, soft green and shivering in the perpetual Kansas wind, and the creek ran alongside the road with the cheerful noise of spring water, and it was the most peaceful hour Maggie had spent in months. Roscoe talked about his ranch with the particular affection of a man who has built something he loves. He talked about the land, the way the grass changed color through the seasons, the specific quality of the light in late afternoon across the flat prairie, the problems and satisfactions of managing 200 head. He asked about her work with a genuine curiosity that was not intrusive, and she found herself answering more fully than she intended, telling him about the laundry work in Abilene, the small room she had rented there, the particular pride of being financially independent even when the independence was narrow and hard. "You're not sorry you left," he said. It was not a question, but she heard the question in it. "Abilene. No, I learned things there. I learned I could manage alone. And coming back." She looked at the creek for a moment. "The jury's still out," she said. He glanced at her with something that was almost a smile. "Give it time." "Easy to say," she said, not unkindly. "I know," he said. "It took me 2 years to feel like Caldwell was mine, and nobody was trying to run me out." They walked back in the long light of the afternoon, and at the door of the harness shop she thanked him for the walk, and he touched his hat and said it had been his pleasure, and she went upstairs and stood at her small window and watched him ride away south and felt something warm and precarious settle in her chest. She was very careful with herself after that. She knew the mathematics of her situation clearly. She was a woman with a precarious position, limited resources, and a reputation that was in the process of slow rehabilitation. Allowing herself to develop feelings for the man who was primarily responsible for that rehabilitation seemed both emotionally foolish and logically complicated, the kind of entanglement that had the potential to unravel everything she was carefully building. But Roscoe came back. He came back on the following Saturday with a book he had thought she might like, a collection of natural history essays that she did not expect to enjoy and found she enjoyed very much. He came back the week after that to say he needed a piano player for a gathering at his ranch for the Cattle Association, and would she be willing? And she started to say she couldn't, and then said yes instead, because the asking had been so straightforward, and the mention of piano playing so casually respectful that refusing it seemed perverse. She rode out to the ranch on a warm Saturday evening, sitting her horse across the spring prairie with the sunset laying down in bands of copper and rose across the western sky, and she saw the Granger spread for the first time and felt her breath catch. It was not grand, but it was deeply cared for, every fence lined tight, the barn solid and well maintained, the house sitting squarely on its foundation with its west-facing porch catching the last of the evening light. There were 2 large cottonwood trees in the yard that were old enough to have been there before Roscoe came, and they moved in the evening air with a particular grace. The gathering was 12 people, ranchers and their wives, seated around the main room of the house, which was furnished simply but with the particular warmth of a space that has been lived in honestly. There was an upright piano against the east wall that had come, Roscoe told her, from a family in Wichita who had sold it before moving further west. She played for 3 hours. She played hymns and dancing tunes and a few of the popular songs that had made their way out along the cattle trail, and she played with the easy skill of a woman who had grown up with music, and returned to it always regardless of circumstances. The room was warm with lamplight and conversation, and the particular ease of people who work hard and are glad of the rest. And Maggie played and felt, without quite having words for it, that she was somewhere she was not unwelcome. Roscoe did not hover, which she noticed and appreciated. He moved through the room as a host, refilling glasses and managing the social current, but she was aware of him in the peripheral way that the body is sometimes aware of things that matter before the mind catches up. And once, when she paused between pieces and looked up, she found him watching her from across the room with an expression that he did not have time to arrange before she saw it. And what was in it was not pity or gratitude or any of the social calculations she had learned to read and prepare for. It was something considerably more direct than that. She looked back at the piano keys and played the opening bars of a waltz and did not look at him again for a while, because she needed to think. By midsummer, Roscoe had become a regular presence in her days, and she had become a regular presence in his, though neither of them had formalized this arrangement or named it. He came to town twice a week on business, and he stopped at Cyrus's on at least one of those visits. They walked the river road on Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted. She had been out to the ranch 3 more times to play for smaller gatherings, and twice she had stayed for supper afterward and sat on the west porch in the blue evening air and talked until the stars came out. The talking was not the small talk of acquaintance. It was the kind of conversation that happens between people who have decided, whether consciously or not, to be honest with each other. He told her about his 9 years working the cattle drives from Texas north, about the long seasons under open sky, about the violence and beauty of the trail and the men who rode it. He told her about his father, who had died when Roscoe was 15, and about the particular hardness of growing up poor in Missouri and deciding early that he would either build something or spend his life building things for other men, and that the first option was preferable regardless of what it cost. She told him about her parents, who had come from Ohio with the conviction that the West was opportunity, and had found it more complicated than the pamphlets suggested. About growing up on the edge of a small settlement, learning piano from a German missionary's wife, developing the habit of paying close attention to the world as a response to its persistent unpredictability. About Hector Ralston, who had been charming in the way that certain men are charming before you live with them long enough to see what the charm is covering. "Were you happy?" Roscoe asked one evening, meaning the marriage, and the directness of the question was characteristic of him. "I was not unhappy at first," she said carefully. "And then I was very unhappy, but I had made a commitment and I took commitment seriously. And then he died, and there was a time when I felt guilty for feeling relieved, and then I stopped feeling guilty because the relief was honest and I was done lying to myself." He was quiet for a moment. "That takes courage," he said, "being honest about relief." "It takes exhaustion mostly," she said. "Fair enough," he said, and there was something in his voice that was gentle without being soft, and she found she had to look away at the darkening prairie to compose herself. It was on a Sunday afternoon in late June when things shifted between them with the clarity of a change in weather. They had walked the river road and were sitting on the bank of the creek in the shade of a large cottonwood, and the water was running low and slow with the summer heat, and the afternoon was very quiet except for bird song and the distant sound of someone's wagon on the road above. Roscoe had been turning something in his hands, a smooth creek stone he had picked up without thinking, and he set it down and said without preamble, "I think about you a great deal." Maggie was looking at the water. She did not look up immediately. She said, "I know." "You know," he repeated, with a slight note of something that might have been relief or might have been amusement. "You are not particularly subtle," she said, and now she did look at him. "Which I appreciate. I have had enough of subtle to last me considerable time." "What do you think about it?" he asked, direct as always. She looked at him for a long moment. She had been thinking about this with great seriousness for weeks, turning it over in her mind with the methodical care she applied to every important question. She had examined her own feelings with particular skepticism, because she had learned not to trust the first version of anything she felt. But the feelings had been examined and re-examined and remained, and the shape of them was unmistakable. "I think about you as well," she said. "And it concerns me somewhat because I have only recently begun to manage my own situation, and complicating it seems unwise." "I'm not proposing complication," he said. "I'm not proposing anything yet, to be plain about it. I'm telling you what's true and asking what you think." "What's true?" she said, tasting the phrase. "What's true is that you are the only person in this town, in perhaps a longer time than I want to admit, who has looked at me and seen a person rather than a problem, and that is more significant to me than I know how to properly account for." He said nothing. He waited. "What's also true," she continued, "is that I am not a romantic fool. I know how situations can look one way and be another. I know that gratitude and genuine feeling can be confused for each other by people who want to believe they are the same thing." "Are you saying you're not sure what you feel?" he asked. "I'm saying I am sure what I feel," she said quietly. "I am less certain it's wise." He turned slightly toward her, and the afternoon light came through the cottonwood leaves in shifting patterns across the ground between them. "Maggie," he said, and the use of her given name without ceremony was new and meant something. "I'm not asking you to be unwise. I'm asking you to let what is true be true between us, and we'll be careful about the rest of it." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, very quietly, "All right." He reached over and took her hand, which was resting on the grass between them, and held it with a simple and unhurried confidence that was nothing like the grasping urgency she had experienced in her marriage. And she sat there beside the summer creek with her hand in his, and felt something settle in her, deeply and solidly, like the last piece of ground you find your footing on. They rode back toward town in the long afternoon with the shadows stretching east, and he brought her to Cyrus's door and helped her down from her horse, which was not technically necessary but was accomplished with such natural courtesy that she did not feel managed by it, and he held her hand one moment longer than necessary before releasing it. "Saturday," he said. It was a statement and a question. "Saturday," she agreed. Dorothy Crane was not finished. Maggie had known this, and Roscoe had known it, and neither of them were surprised when the next development occurred, only by its specific form. In late July, Dorothy Crane came to Reverend Booth with a formal request that he address the congregation about the moral risks of associating with persons of questionable character. And while she did not name Maggie specifically in her request to the Reverend, the clarity of her meaning was total. She additionally spoke to 3 of the Cattle Association members' wives, and suggested that the continued use of Maggie Ralston as a pianist at ranch gatherings was inconsistent with the standards of the community. Reverend Booth, who was a complicated man, neither as brave as he wanted to be nor as craven as Dorothy sometimes required him to be, did not preach the sermon Dorothy had requested, but did have a private conversation with Roscoe Granger in which he expressed his concern about the optics of the situation, and gently suggested that perhaps a degree of discretion was called for. Roscoe listened to the Reverend with the full attention of a man who is deciding something as he listens, and when the Reverend had finished he said, calmly and politely, "I appreciate you coming to me directly, Reverend. I want to tell you directly in return that I intend to continue associating with Maggie Ralston, because she is a woman of good character, and I hold her in high esteem. I'm sorry if that creates difficulties, but I'm not going to pretend otherwise." The Reverend went home in a state of private agitation and told his wife, who told Clara Albright, who told Maggie the following morning over the laundry she had brought around. Maggie sat with this information for a while after Clara left, turning it over. He had defended her again, not in the public dramatic way of the square, but in the quieter and in some ways more durable way of simple refusal to back down when asked privately to do so. There was something in this that moved her more than the public declaration had, because the public declaration had been witnessed and applauded, but this private refusal had an audience of exactly one and no social reward attached to it. She went to see him that afternoon, riding out to the ranch alone, which was a thing she had not done before, and which constituted a statement she was making deliberately. She found him mending a section of the south fence line with Pete Donovan, both men working in the July heat with their shirts dark with sweat. Roscoe saw her coming and straightened, and there was something in his expression that was entirely open and glad in a way he did not attempt to manage. "Mrs. Ralston," Pete said pleasantly, because Pete was a reasonable man who had taken his cue from his employer some months ago. "Mr. Donovan," she said. Then she looked at Roscoe. "Can I speak with you?" Pete found something requiring his attention at the far end of the fence line with admirable efficiency. Roscoe walked to her and stopped and looked at her, his hat pushed back on his head, squinting slightly against the afternoon glare. "Clara Albright told me what you said to Reverend Booth," she said. "Did she?" he said. "You did not have to do that. You did not have to refuse him." "I know, Roscoe," she said, and using his given name out here in the open air on his own land felt significant and right. "I want to say something to you plainly, and I want you to hear it." "I'm listening," he said. "I am not a cause," she said. "I am not a project or a principle or a woman who needs saving. I am a person who is capable of managing her own situation, and I have been doing so, imperfectly but honestly, for some years now." "I know that," he said, with a seriousness that told her he genuinely did. "I'm telling you because I want what exists between us to exist between equals," she said. "Not between a man who is generous and a woman who is grateful. That is not what I want, and I do not believe it is what you want either." He looked at her for a moment and then said, "No, it is not what I want." "Good," she said. "What do you want?" he asked. The afternoon stretched around them, the flat Kansas land reaching away in every direction, the summer heat pressing down, the fence wire bright in the sun. Somewhere to the south one of the cattle lowed. "I want to know you better," she said. "I want to see whether what I feel when I am with you is the beginning of something real, and I want to do that without owing you for it. I can take care of my own situation with Mrs. Crane. What I can't do is let the person I'm coming to care for be the same person I'm dependent on for my survival, because that is how I found myself in a bad marriage, and I will not repeat the shape of it." He was quiet for a long time, the fence wire sang slightly in the wind. "That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in recent memory," he said at last. "I told you I was done lying to myself," she said. "You did," he said. And then, with that directness that she had come to value as something fundamental to who he was, "I hear everything you've said, all of it, and I want to say in return that I am not trying to save you. I never was. I was trying to do what was right because I thought it was right, and you were part of that, but you are not only that, not to me, not for some time now." "How long?" she asked, which was perhaps not entirely necessary, but she wanted to know. "Since the afternoon on the river road when you told me that Mrs. Crane's technique was effective and you would give her that," he said. "The way you said it, like you could see clearly even when you were being hurt by it. That was when I stopped thinking of this as a matter of principle." She had not been expecting the specificity of that, and it caught her, and she had to look away briefly at the grass and compose herself. "All right," she said at last, which was becoming, she noted, her standard answer when he said things that required a large response she didn't have the language for yet. He smiled at her, warm and unhurried, and said, "Stay for supper." She stayed for supper. Through August and September the rhythm of their time together deepened into something that both of them understood was not casual, though neither had yet put a formal name on it. Roscoe came to town 3 times a week now, and she came out to the ranch every Sunday. And on those Sundays she began to know the land of the Granger spread the way you come to know a place you are considering making your own. She learned the names of the hands, Pete Donovan and Jim Birch, and the 2 younger men, Sam and Henry, who were brothers from Oklahoma and worked hard and were generally cheerful. She learned where the spring ran fresh and cold, and where the grass went thin in dry weather, and where the barn cats had a reliable habit of hunting in the evening along the south fence. She was also managing Dorothy Crane on her own terms. In August, she went to Gerald Pratt's Mercantile with Clara Albright, who had made it a point of personal honor to accompany Maggie to establishments that had been less than welcoming. Pratt looked at Clara Albright's money and looked at Maggie standing beside her with the contained patience of a woman who has all the time in the world, and he served them both. It was not warm, but it was service, and that was a boundary crossed. She applied to Mrs. Henderson for full-time work at the laundry rather than piecework, and Mrs. Henderson, who had been watching the gradual change in Caldwell's temperature with the pragmatic attention of a businesswoman, said yes. The wages were not generous, but they were regular, and regularity was what Maggie needed most. In September, she wrote a letter to the Ladies' Committee for Community Standards. She wrote it carefully and kept it on her small table for 3 days before she sent it. The letter was not angry, and it was not apologetic. It stated, in plain and correct language, that she was a resident of Caldwell who intended to remain a resident of Caldwell, that she conducted herself by standards she believed to be consistent with those of any honest community, and that she welcomed the opportunity to demonstrate this through her work and conduct over time. She did not ask anything from the committee. She simply made her position clear as a declaration rather than a petition. Dorothy Crane did not respond, which was itself a kind of response. The active campaign had not exactly ended, but it had contracted, withdrawn to the hard core of Dorothy's own household and the 2 or 3 women who were most committed to her world view. The wider town had, with the characteristic pragmatism of a community that had more pressing things to attend to, largely moved on to other concerns. Roscoe heard about the letter and said only, "You didn't need to run that by me first." "I know," she said. "That's why I didn't." He looked at her with that warm, honest expression she had come to trust and said, "I am very glad I got that harness fitting checked that day." "The fitting that was perfectly fine," she said. "I had a hunch it might need looking at," he said, without the slightest embarrassment. She laughed properly, the way she had forgotten she could laugh. October came in with a clear, cold light and the grass going gold across the prairie, and the evenings on the porch of the ranch house grew shorter as the sunset came earlier, but they stayed out anyway in their coats, watching the stars appear over the flat land, and on one such evening Roscoe turned to her and said, with the directness that was the most consistent thing about him, "I want to ask you something, and I want to be clear that there is no pressure attached to the asking." "All right," she said. "I would like you to marry me," he said. "Not because of anything except that I love you and I want to spend my life with you, and this land and this house feel like they are waiting for you to be part of them, and I think you might feel the same, though I know you'll tell me honestly if you don't." The stars were very clear, and the night was very quiet, and the prairie stretched away in all directions into the dark. Maggie sat with this for a moment. She was aware of her own heart, which was doing something complicated and emphatic. "I love you," she said. "I have known it for some time, and I've been careful with it because I didn't want to be wrong, but I am not wrong. Is that a yes?" He asked with a slight note of something that was almost uncertainty, which was rare for him, and which she found unexpectedly dear. "That is a yes," she said. He reached over and took her hand, as he had that afternoon by the summer creek, with the same unhurried confidence, and she held it back and they sat on the porch of the house that was going to be hers as well, under the vast Kansas sky, and she felt something she had not felt in so long she had almost forgotten the quality of it. She felt safe, and she felt seen, and she felt that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They were married in November, which in Caldwell meant the cold had arrived properly, and the prairie was brown, and the sky was the deep pale gray of the season. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Booth, who had reached the private conclusion that the tide had turned, and that his pastoral role was better served by presiding over a marriage than by aligning himself with Dorothy Crane's diminishing authority, and who was therefore gracious and sincere on the day. The wedding was not large, but it was not small either. Frank and Clara Albright were there. Pete Donovan and the other ranch hands stood in the back pew in their best clothes with their hats in their hands. Thomas Birch the rancher came with his wife. Mrs. Henderson from the laundry came, and 3 of the women from the eastern side of town who had become gradually and then decisively friendly to Maggie over the summer months. Cyrus Webb came, his best coat brushed and his expression one of approximately pleased, which for Cyrus was effusive. Dorothy Crane was not there, but Dorothy Crane's absence was simply an absence and nothing more. Maggie wore a dress of deep ivory wool that Clara Albright had helped her sew, and she walked down the aisle of the Caldwell church with her head up and her hands steady. And when she saw Roscoe standing at the front with Pete beside him as his attendant, wearing a new coat, and looking at her with an expression so full and open that it made her throat tighten, she felt the last of the long tension she had been carrying release. He held her hands during the vows, and his hands were warm and steady, and she said the words with her full voice and her full intention, and he did the same, and Reverend Booth pronounced them married with a particular warmth that was probably a form of penance and was nonetheless appreciated. They rode back to the ranch in the clear, cold afternoon, and the hands had decorated the house with the kind of cheerful amateur enthusiasm that made it look festive in an entirely sincere way. And Clara Albright had organized a supper that was better than anything Caldwell had produced in some time, and they ate and drank, and there was music, because Roscoe had asked Maggie to play, and she had said that she was not playing at her own wedding, and he had laughed and hired a fiddler from the next county. That night, after everyone had gone and the house was quiet, Maggie stood at the window of what was now their bedroom and looked out at the dark prairie, the stars impossibly bright above it, the grass barely visible in the silver light. She could hear Roscoe moving quietly downstairs, banking the fire for the night. She had come back to Caldwell in the spring with 2 saddlebags and no prospects, and a reputation that the town had decided was a verdict. She stood here now in November in a house that was hers and a marriage that was honest, and with a man who had stood in the town square and said her name out loud with a pride that she had not had the ability at the time to fully receive, and she received it now, quietly and completely. He came upstairs and she turned from the window, and he looked at her in the lamplight with that open expression she had come to know as the truest version of him, and he said, "You all right?" "I am so much more than all right," she said. He came across the room and put his hands on either side of her face with a gentleness that had always been present in him, and pulled her gently toward him and kissed her. And the November wind pressed against the window glass, and the fire sent its warmth through the house. And outside the Kansas stars burned cold and steady over 360 acres of land that was theirs. The first winter of their marriage was hard in the way that Kansas winters were hard, the cold coming down from the north in waves that made the grass snap and the creek ice over, and the cattle crowd together along the south fence for warmth. Roscoe and the hands rode out daily regardless of whether to check the herd, coming back red-faced and frostbitten, and Maggie ran the house and the kitchen with the same methodical competence she had applied to everything in her life. She cooked for the hands as well as for the 2 of them, because it made practical sense, and because she liked the warm, busy noise of people at the long kitchen table, which was the opposite of the solitary suppers she had eaten in her room at Cyrus Webb's. She learned the land that winter in the way you learn a thing you intend to keep, walking the fence lines with Roscoe in the brief bright hours of January afternoons, learning the names of the sections, the south pasture and the creek meadow and the far corner that got the morning sun first. She quit the laundry work at Mrs. Henderson's in December, which was a decision she made herself based on the arithmetic of time and travel, and she wrote a careful letter to Mrs. Henderson explaining her reasoning and thanking her for the work, and Mrs. Henderson wrote back wishing her well, which was generous and satisfying. Dorothy Crane remained in Caldwell. She was not going anywhere, and neither was Maggie, and they existed in the same small town with a careful distance that was maintained by both parties and generally respected by everyone who understood what had happened the previous spring. Dorothy did not speak to Maggie directly. Maggie did not require her to. The campaign was over, not because Dorothy had changed her opinion, but because the opinion had ceased to have the power it previously held. Opinions needed a community to operate in, and Caldwell's community had made its choice, gradually and imperfectly but ultimately clearly. There was one afternoon in February when Maggie walked into the dry goods store and found herself standing next to Dorothy Crane at the counter, and they were both there for perhaps 3 minutes waiting to be served, and Dorothy looked straight ahead at the shelves, and Maggie looked straight ahead at the shelves, and neither spoke. It was not comfortable, but it was manageable, and manageable was the honest category for it. On the ride home that afternoon, Maggie told Roscoe about it, and he listened and then said, "How did it feel?" "Like being in the same room with a storm that has already passed," she said. "Uncomfortable but not dangerous." "Good," he said, and there was something in his voice that was both satisfaction and relief. Spring came again, the second spring since Maggie had ridden back into Caldwell on that bruise-colored morning, and with spring came something she had known was possible and had waited for with a quiet, careful hope. She told Roscoe on an April evening on the west porch, where they had developed the habit of sitting after supper to watch the sunset come in over the flat land. "I'm expecting a child," she said. He was very still for a moment. Then he turned to look at her, and his expression was so full of something large and honest that she had to press her lips together to keep herself from crying, which was not a thing she did easily. "Are you well?" he asked first, which was characteristic and which she loved. "I am very well," she said. He reached over and took her hand, as he always did, and held it, and they sat together in the April evening, while the sky went gold and rose above the prairie, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, which was a new thing for her, not because he had not made it available before, but because she had been careful about allowing herself such particular vulnerabilities, and she was less careful now, and it was good. The summer of 1880 was warm and clear, and the cattle moved well, and the herd grew. Pete Donovan got himself engaged to a woman from Wichita and brought her to meet the Grangers with an expression of considerable nervousness that was fully unwarranted, as she was a sensible woman named Louise who shook hands with Maggie firmly and said she had heard good things about the Granger ranch and looked around at it with the practical eye of a person who was thinking about the future. Clara Albright became one of Maggie's closest friends, the kind of friendship built on genuine mutual respect and the particular bond of women who have chosen sides in the same difficult situation. They rode into town together on Wednesdays, and Clara had an excellent dry humor that Maggie had not initially noticed and subsequently found indispensable, and they argued amicably about books and agreed completely about people, and had the kind of friendship that was fully comfortable with silence. In August, a man came to Caldwell who complicated things for approximately 2 weeks and then resolved himself. His name was Carter Webb, no relation to Cyrus, and he was a former associate of Hector Ralston's who had heard, through the specifically efficient grapevine of men who owed debts and traded information, that Hector's widow had married a rancher with a good spread and money in the bank. He came to the ranch on a Thursday morning while Roscoe was out on the south pasture, and he told Maggie, with the practiced ease of a man who has run this particular scheme before, that Hector had owed him money, and that the debt transferred to the widow by the laws he cited incorrectly, and that he would be willing to be reasonable about the terms. Maggie listened to him in the doorway of her own house with the expression she had developed over years of managing difficult things, which was pleasant and entirely opaque, and when he had finished she said, "I will refer you to my husband, who handles our financial affairs. You're welcome to wait on the porch if you like. He should be back by midday." She went inside and sent Sam on his fastest horse to find Roscoe. Roscoe came back to the ranch an hour later and spoke to Carter Webb privately on the porch for 20 minutes. The conversation was apparently thorough and conclusive, because Carter Webb rode away from the Granger ranch before noon and was seen leaving Caldwell entirely by the following morning. Roscoe came inside afterward and Maggie looked at him from across the kitchen table. "What did you tell him?" She said. "The truth," Roscoe said. "The legal truth, which is that no debt of Hector Ralston's attaches to you personally and certainly not to our household. And the practical truth, which is that I know who he is and what he is, and that Caldwell has a sheriff who is a personal friend of mine and who would be glad of a reason to look more closely at Mr. Webb's recent activities." "And that resolved it," she said. "Quite completely," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "That one I did as your husband," he said, "not as a matter of principle." "I know the difference," she said. He smiled at her across the kitchen table with the full warmth of it, and she smiled back, and the autumn light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table between them. In September, Roscoe Granger II was born, which surprised precisely no one except Roscoe himself, who had privately assumed it would be a girl in the way that people assume things they haven't examined, and who received his son with an expression of absolute wonder that Maggie would remember for the rest of her life. The birth was managed by Dr. Hartley, who had come to Caldwell the previous year and was a thorough, practical man, and Clara Albright, who had done this before with her own 2 children, and who was steady and confident in a way that Maggie was deeply grateful for throughout the whole long ordeal of it. When it was over and the room was quiet and the doctor had gone and Clara was downstairs making coffee, Roscoe sat beside the bed with his son in his arms and looked at this small, reddish, entirely serious person with an expression so naked and undefended that Maggie felt tears move through her for the second time in her marriage without the usual self-management catching them in time. "He looks uncertain about the whole enterprise," she said. "Sensible," Roscoe said, without taking his eyes off the baby. "It's a lot to take in. He has your nose," she said. "Poor creature," Roscoe said. She laughed, which was not what she had expected to be able to do, given how tired she was, and he looked up at her with all of it in his eyes, the love and the relief and the particular awe of this specific moment. And she reached over and put her hand on his arm, and he leaned forward and pressed his lips to her hair. They named him James Roscoe Granger. James after Maggie's father, Roscoe for the obvious reason, and his middle name from the beginning was the one everyone used except for formal occasions. The Caldwell that young James Granger grew up in was different, in the specific and important ways, from the Caldwell that Maggie had ridden back into in the spring of 1879. Not all different. Dorothy Crane was still there and still held her opinions with the conviction of a woman who had never been seriously required to revise them, and there were still people who remembered the Lone Star Saloon and the committee petition and drew their conclusions accordingly. The world does not change completely, ever, and expecting it to is a form of wishful thinking that Maggie had long since given up. But there was more than there had been before. There was a seat in the church where Maggie sat every Sunday with Roscoe beside her and young James between them, and the seat was unremarkable, which was everything. There was a standing in the community that had been built over years of honest dealing and consistent character, not given and not inherited but earned, which made it solid in the particular way of things earned. There was Frank and Clara Albright stopping by on Sunday afternoons, and Pete Donovan and Louise at the neighboring table at the Caldwell supper dances that had become a seasonal institution, and Thomas Birch's handshake and his wife's warm hello. There was the ranch, which had grown to 400 acres by 1882, when Roscoe bought the section to the east from a man who was moving his family to Colorado. The herd was 300 head now, and they had built a second barn and added a bunkhouse that was considerably better than the arrangement Pete and the men had made do with previously. And there was a kitchen garden behind the house that Maggie had put in with the same methodical care she put into everything. And in summer it produced more than they needed, and she took the surplus into town, selling it from the wagon on Saturday mornings, which was a thing that earned her a particular kind of reputation. As a woman of practical generosity, who measured what she gave but gave it fully. James was 3 when Dorothy Crane finally spoke to Maggie directly, which was not something Maggie had anticipated or required. They met in the dry goods store on a Tuesday afternoon, which had become unremarkable as a location for their parallel errands, and Dorothy looked at Maggie for a moment with an expression that was complicated and not entirely unfriendly and said, "Your boy, he has his father's eyes." It was not much. It was not an apology or a retraction, and it was not the kind of thing that undid what had been done or restored what had been taken. But it was a direct sentence addressed to Maggie Ralston Granger from Dorothy Crane without hostility, and Maggie received it with the same plain honesty she applied to everything. "He does," she said. "He has rather a lot of his father, in fact. It seems fair." Dorothy made a sound that was nearly a laugh, which apparently surprised her as well, and she moved away down the aisle and Maggie turned back to her list, and that was that. She told Roscoe about it that evening on the west porch, with the sunset spreading its colors across the sky and James asleep upstairs and the prairie settling into its evening quiet. "She said he had my eyes," Roscoe said. "She has apparently noticed you have eyes. People generally do," he said, in the tone of gentle absurdity that she had discovered was his preferred register for things he was privately pleased about. She leaned against him on the porch bench, her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the last light go down behind the western horizon. By 1883, the ranch was well and truly established. Roscoe had developed a reputation in the county as a man who dealt straight and managed his land wisely, which brought him a modest but real influence in the cattle association, and in the broader conversations about water rights and grazing land that were becoming increasingly important as Kansas filled in with settlers. He sat on the association board and said what he thought and was generally listened to, not because he was loudest, but because what he said had consistently proven to be sound. Maggie ran the household and the kitchen garden and managed the books, which she had taken over in the second year of their marriage when it became apparent that she had a cleaner and more systematic mind for numbers than Roscoe, who acknowledged this without any particular pride and turned the ledgers over to her with complete confidence. She had developed her own standing in the community, distinct from being Roscoe Granger's wife, though not separate from it, the standing of a woman who was known to be reliable and honest, and who had been tested in specific ways and had not broken. Clara Albright had children the same age as James, and the two families were woven together in the comfortable way of people who have built friendship through genuine shared history, the kind of friendship that does not require maintenance because it has structure. Maggie and Clara rode into town together on Wednesdays, and the Wednesday ride had become a standing joke between their husbands who knew that the world would likely stop before the Wednesday ride did. In the autumn of 1883, Maggie found herself expecting again, which was something she received with a profound and uncomplicated gladness. She told Roscoe at the kitchen table over breakfast, because she had found that important things were always said at the kitchen table in their household, which was something about its particular plainness and the good morning light, and the way they both looked more themselves in the morning than at any other time. He put down his coffee and looked at her for a moment and said, "How do you feel?" "Entirely well," she said. "James is going to be spectacular about this," he said, meaning that James, who was 3½ and deeply interested in his own preeminence in the household, was going to be deeply interesting about the arrival of a sibling. "He'll manage," she said. "You're generous," Roscoe said. She laughed and reached across the table, and he took her hand across the coffee cups and the butter dish, and the morning light came in through the kitchen window and lay across the table, and he looked at her in the specific way he had of looking at her that she had never found diminished by familiarity, only deepened by it, and she felt, as she had learned to let herself feel, the full weight of it. In the spring of 1884, Their daughter was born on a warm April morning with the cottonwoods newly leafed and the creek running high. Dr. Hartley was there again and Clara Albright, and the birth was easier than the first, which Maggie received as a practical mercy. James, who had been managed through the process by Pete Donovan with considerable creative effort, was brought in to see his sister at midday, and his expression moved through several phases of assessment before settling on something that looked cautiously like approval. They named her Eleanor, after no one in particular and both of them in general, because Eleanor seemed like a name that required a person to grow into it, and they wanted to give her that challenge. She was, from the first week, a person of considerable opinions, which she expressed clearly and without apology, which Roscoe said was exactly what he would have expected, and Maggie said was a trait she had no idea where Eleanor could possibly have gotten. By 1885, the Granger Ranch had become a fixture of the Caldwell landscape in the way that solid things become fixtures, not through any single moment, but through the accumulated weight of years of being consistently what they were. The house had expanded, a second bedroom and a proper sitting room added onto the original structure, and the porch had been rebuilt wider, and in summer it held 2 chairs and a small table, and the view west was unchanged and unchangeable. Maggie sat on that porch on a June evening of that year, watching the sun go down, Eleanor on her lap and James at her feet with a stick, and a serious project involving the ground that had occupied him for an hour. Roscoe came out of the house and settled into the chair beside her and looked at the sky. "Mrs. Crane is moving to her daughter's family in Wichita," he said. "I heard it from Frank today." "Ah," Maggie said. "How do you feel about that?" She thought about it for a moment honestly. She thought about the woman who had stood in the church door and told her she was unwelcome. She thought about the petition, the committee, the letter in block capitals on good paper. She thought about the dry goods store and the mercantile and the cold shoulders and the small daily machinery of exclusion that had been deployed against her with such consistent precision. She thought about riding back into town on that bruise-colored morning with 2 saddlebags and nothing else. "I hope she's well," she said, which was the truest thing she could say, because she had discovered that carrying resentment was a weight that cost more than it was worth, and that the release of it was not weakness but efficiency. Roscoe looked at her with that expression that she had long since recognized as the one he wore when he was profoundly at peace with something. "You are a better person than I am," he said. "You stood up in the town square and said my name out loud," she said. "I think we can call it even." He reached over and she gave him her free hand and he held it. Eleanor balanced contentedly on Maggie's other arm, James muttering over his project at their feet, the Kansas sun going down in its old extravagant way over the flat and beautiful land. She thought about that morning in the spring of 1879, riding down the main street with every soul watching her and knowing exactly what kind of woman they believed her to be. She thought about climbing the stairs to Cyrus Webb's small room that smelled of oil and hay. She thought about the narrow bed and the careful savings and the piecework and the cold shoulders and the church steps and Dorothy Crane's charitable concern. She thought about a man walking into the harness shop and taking off his hat and saying, in the plainest possible terms, that she had as much right to be in this town as anyone else in it. The cottonwoods across the yard moved in the evening air, the same ones that had been there before Roscoe came, that would be there after both of them, that had grown large and easy in their deep roots and reached toward the sky without any particular anxiety about whether they were allowed to be there. James abandoned his project and climbed up onto the porch and leaned against his father's leg, and Roscoe put a hand on the boy's head without interrupting the conversation of the evening, which was conducted without words now, the way the best conversations often are, in the comfortable language of people who have learned each other thoroughly, and found that what they learned was worth keeping. Eleanor made a small, decisive sound and grabbed at the air with one determined hand. "Hungry," Roscoe said. "Always," Maggie agreed. She got up to go inside and he stood with her, because he generally stood when she stood and sat when she sat, which was not a rule but a habit of partnership, and James followed, and a leaner was carried into the warm kitchen where the fire was laid for supper, and the evening was beginning its quiet descent into the long dark of a Kansas June, and the stars would come out over the flat land as they always did, indifferent and beautiful and entirely reliable. Outside, the prairie stretched south and east and west and north in all directions, the grass beginning to cool as the sun descended, the fence lines Roscoe had built running straight and true across the land, the cattle settling toward the creek for their evening water, the barn casting its long shadow east. The west porch held 2 empty chairs and the last warmth of the sunlight, and the view that did not change. Inside the house that Roscoe had built and that Maggie had made into a home, there were voices and lamplight and the ordinary sounds of a life being lived without apology or diminishment. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything.